Okay, good morning, everyone. What's going on here? So, and online, Josh. I just really want to spend today learning two Tosusim Masel Paga and Tosusim Masel High Ugla. So you've come in the middle of a quite technical sugya, but we'll move on from that. So Tosus Divyam, and there's a marshal. I hope that people see my WhatsApp message to have a look at the marshal. Hopefully on important marshal on both Tosus and just I guess I should precede everything I'm going to say by saying I'm not entirely sure that I've plumbed. In fact, sorry, I'll phrase it differently. I'm entirely sure that I have not plumbed the depth of Tosus. I'm definitely struggling with these two Tosusim, but I'll do my best. And Baruch Hashem, we have the great light of the marshal to help us work through what's very difficult otherwise. Masel is not printed on the sheets, the Mashal. It's not printed on the sheets, it's in the back of the Gemara of the Mashal. I apologize if people didn't see it, but I'll summarize this to you anyway. In Tosus the Masel Paga, so just to summarize the Gemara really, the Gemara brings a machlokas Tanoim, which also shifts into the generation of the Amoraim and the view of Rav Nachman as to how to halachically deal with moving Muktza through moving something else, which is referred to as Titul and HaTsad. That's the summary of the Gemara. So I have coals sitting on top of my cake, which is baking. I have straw sitting on top of my unripe fruit, or I have earth sitting on top of my radish. In all these cases, by taking out the loaf, the cake, the radish, the fruit, I'm unavoidably also moving some Muktza. And the question is, can I do so or not? And the broad halachic headline that refers to this act is Titul and HaTsad. I'm moving the fruit or the cake, and incidentally, something else is also being moved. And the basis of the view not to do so is because I'm still moving Muktza and I'm not allowed to move Muktza. The basis of the view to do so is because I'm not engaging with the Muktza directly. That's the background of the sugya. Now, I want to really two introductions to Tosfos. The first introduction emerges conceptually from the answers of Tosfos, and we've already seen these ideas again and again before, which is that not all Titul and HaTsad is created equally. So even though a first glance reading of the Gemara seems to think that to imply there is a digital Shiur going on over here. Is Titul and HaTsad allowed or not allowed? By the time you go through all the sugyas, it turns out that there's layers of Titul and HaTsad, and that there can be that even the opinion that says that Titul and HaTsad lo shmei Titul is not called directly engaging with the Muktza might agree that sometimes it is called direct engagement. And in other words, we can't just sort of line up a black and white answer. Titul and HaTsad, yes allowed or not allowed. There can be degrees of engagement. We saw, for example, when we learned Daf Mem Beis ages ago, we saw this idea. We saw a distinction in the Rishonim between Titul and HaTsad when I'm doing so for the sake of the Muktza and I'm doing so for the sake of the non-Muktza item. So one scenario we saw was a dead body on a stretcher on a bed. The bed is not Muktza, the dead body is Muktza, and I want to move the bed in order to move the dead body. So I'm doing it for the sake of the Muktza item. I want to give kavod hameis, very important value, but Muktza is equally an important value. How do I balance the two? That's the discussion of the Gemara. But even though I'm only indirectly moving the dead body, nonetheless, the Rishonim say that even the figures that normally allow Titul and HaTsad might agree that in this case not. Because Titul and HaTsad is when I'm only interested in the non-Muktza. I want the radish, I want the cake. The Muktza happens to be lifted with it, so in no way am I engaging with the Muktza. Physically, I'm not engaging with the Muktza, and conceptually, I'm not engaging with the Muktza. That's pure Titul and HaTsad. Whereas in the case of the dead body, I want to move the dead body, therefore it's called engagement with the Muktza. So we've seen that already, and from Tosfos will emerge many more such distinctions. That's Hakdama number 1 to Tosfos. Hakdama number 2 is what really bothers Tosfos is that aside from the problem that I'm indirectly moving the Muktza, I have a second problem over here, which is that I am moving the non-Muktza item. And in many cases, the non-Muktza item has become infected with the Muktza status of the Muktza sitting on top of it through the mechanism of basis. So if I have a tray, which is not Muktza, and on the tray I put something which is Muktza, the tray has somehow been subsumed to the Muktza item because it's serving the Muktza item, and therefore it's become a bossis. It's also become Muktza. It's become dedicated to a Muktza purpose, and therefore it's also become Muktza. So leave aside Titul and HaTsad, that when I'm moving the tray, I'm moving the object on top of which is Muktza. I'm also moving the tray, and therefore it should become Muktza. So in our example, for example, on top of the chaburah, the loaf, is sitting coals. So why am I only getting worried about moving the coals indirectly, which is the suk of Titul and HaTsad? I'm also moving Muktza directly because the chaburah has become Muktza, because it is a bossis, a tray on which is resting a Muktza item. Thus asks Tosfos Divya Maschil Paga. So very briefly, in the last year, we gave, I think, 3 answers. I think did we get through all 3 answers in the last year? I think we got all 3 answers. The first answer is Tosfos' answer, which says it doesn't become a bossis because I never had intention to leave the muktzah on top of it. I knew that I put the cake in the coals or the unripe fruit in the BaTeven temporarily, and bossis is only when I want to leave it on permanently, at least for the whole of Shabbos. This is answer number 1. Answer number 2, the Rishonim give, which seems such a powerful answer, it's hard to understand why Tosfos didn't answer this. She says the concept of bossis is when I'm making something there as the servant for the object sitting on top of it. I want the money, for example, to be resting on the tray. Over here, the radish or the cake is not the fruit is not the servant of the coal or the dust. It's quite the contrary. I'm putting the coal or the straw there in order to ripen the fruit, in order to cook the cake. So the cake is not nullified, it's not there to serve the muktzah item, and therefore the concept of bossis wouldn't apply. And the third answer we saw was, I think I gave out the sheet, the Ramah, who says that food doesn't become bossis because food is its own independent entity, it's not there to serve other things. Those are the 3 answers we saw. That's Tosfos to a Maschil Paga. Tosfos to a Maschil Hai Hugla is a very, very unclear Tosfos, because he seems to revisit the same issue, but with somewhat different terminology, and focusing this time on Rav Nachman rather than on the original Machlokas Rabbanon and Rabbizobin today, and also seems to be picking on poor Rav Nachman when really it's a conceptual question on the Brisa already itself. So, and he seems to give very different sorts of answers. So the question of Tosfos needs quite a lot of careful thought, and then the answer of Tosfos is also equally murky, because Tosfos again does answer like he answers in the previous question. They were talking in a case where he didn't intend to leave it on, but seems to get into much more complicated discussions. The Tosfos of the Ramasal Hai Pugla seems to be a repetition of Paga, but with many, many more layers of complexity to it, and is almost an unreadable Tosfos. I struggled mightily with Tosfos until I should have done this at the beginning. I should have looked in the Mashal earlier, but when you look in the Mashal, the Mashal brings a light to the whole topic. So I'm just thinking how to structure this. Maybe let's read Tosfos inside. I know we often don't read things inside. I sort of give the summary and rely on everyone having an answer, but I think in this case we should read it inside. Hai Pugla. So the Pugla is this sinoin, this radish, whatever it is, which is in the ground. So basically, Rav Nachman taught us that if the Pugla is positioned such that by lifting up the Pugla, inevitably earth will be lifted up with it, then that's Titul and HaTsad and it's Asa. However, if the Pugla is positioned such that you can move it without lifting the earth up with it, then it's Mutter because there's no Titul and HaTsad. That's what Nachman's view. Asks Tosfos, V'im Toma, if you will ask, Hai Pugla, Hai Chadami. If this radish is, what's the situation of this radish? If you placed it in the earth, my Tama demand a what would be the heter for the one who allows it in the case where you can move it out without lifting up earth? Even just shaking off isn't allowed. How much more so Titul min HaTsad? Because it's a bossis. And if you forgot it there, in other words, you didn't intend to place the earth on top of the radish. My Tama demand also. What's the view of the man? The opinion that says it's also. You're even allowed to move it completely. For need. And then Tosfos gives 2 examples. He gives the example of your bed where you forgot your purse on top of the bed, and an example of a barrel of wine where a stone was left on top of the barrel of wine. And in both cases, you can lift up or tilt, if need be, lift up if there's no other way to do it, or tilt the bed so that the money falls off, so that the stone falls off, in order to get access to them on Shabbos. Okay, so to summarize what we've said so far, Tosfos really asks a double question. The first part of his question is that if you deliberately left the tznoin buried in the ground, it should become a bossis, which is really a repetition of his previous question in the previous Tosfos. And his second part of his question is, if it was shochach, if you forgot it, which was in a sense his answer in the previous Tosfos, then we see later a Mishnah, an explicit Mishnah in Kufman based on a base that says there's no Issa at all, Kal v'chomer our scenario. Because there's an explicit Mishnah, you don't need anyone else to say anything. You have a Mefurish Mishnah that says that if you forgot money on your bed or you forgot a stone on top of the chavis, you're allowed to upend the bed or lift up the barrel and the stone will fall off, the money will fall off. So says Tosfos in his question. Now, on this, the Marsha effectively asks the following question, which is, why is Tosfos only asking this question here on Rav Nachman? He could have asked it, for that matter, on the previous Gemara, the Machlokas Rabbanon and Rabbizobin Tardoi, because you have the same question over there. What's the scenario of the Rabbanon and Rabbizobin Tardoi who are getting themselves worried about Titul min HaTsad? We have the same question. If it's a bosses, it should be Asa. And if it's not a bosses, like Tosfos answered in his last question, that it's not a bosses because you didn't intend to leave it there, then we have an explicit Mishnah that allows it. So why didn't Tosfos ask that on the previous Bryce or on the previous Bryce already there? It's really the same question. Why do Rabbanon and Rabbizobin Tardoi arguing about Titul min HaTsad? We have an explicit Mishnah that says that if you leave a purse on a bed or a stone on a chavis, you're allowed to move the chavis or the bed. So it's not just a question on Nachman, it's a question on a Bryce. Answers the Marsha that on the Bryce there's no question, because the Bryce is Tanoim. The Tana can argue on a Mishnah. So we have a Bryce that argues on the Mishnah. We're used to that. But Rav Nachman is an Amora. So why is Rav Nachman arguing on a Mishnah? That's the pshat in Tosfos' question. So says the Marsha. Now, there's much maths and concept that we need to crunch in this Marsha's point, but in others, we just need to cheshbon out. So what's the reading of Tosfos according to the Marsha? And then we need to understand what conceptual insight emerges from this, and we'll do both in a minute. But again, that's the answer to the Marsha, that Tosfos, in his first Tosfos, is dealing with an internal conundrum, which is how do the Tanoim deal with the issue of bosses? Tosfos in the second question is asking from a Mishnah. You have a Mishnah which says explicitly you can tilt a bed. You have a Mishnah which says explicitly you can lift up the chavis and shake off the stone. And the Mishnah is not worried about Titul min HaTsad. How can Rav Nachman ignore a Mishnah? Rav Nachman's an Amora. Amoraim in general shouldn't ignore Mishnayos, and wouldn't even paskin like Bryces against Mishnayos. That's how the Marsha reads Tosfos' question. Yes, Adam.
Isn't there a difference between in the case of the mart in the car, you're moving your allowable clip? I understand the question about bosses double awesome, but it's still, in our case, when there's still be a problem by shifting the straw, the tevin, you're still doing a Titul min HaTsad.
When you move the bed, you're lifting up a purse. So it's also Titul min HaTsad. It's seemingly identical.
The item you're moving, you're physically moving the bed, as opposed to whilst here you are physically moving the straw. No,
the radish is parallel to the bed, both on Muktza items. The straw and the money are both Muktza items. In both cases, you're physically engaging with a non-Muktza item, and through so doing, moving a Muktza item. That's Tosfos' equation.
But I thought in the second, maybe I'm thinking about in the second case where it's completely buried, then it would be different.
Well, no, not necessarily. It depends how you learn the second case. If the second case you're directly moving the straw to get access to it, then you're correct. You're directly moving it. But if you're just lifting up and through lifting up you're moving it, then not. And we saw that's Masechet Shabbat, that's the movie and everything else. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's Tosfos' question. And the Marsha says there's a question on Rav Nachman as opposed to on the Bryce. The Bryces can argue with Mishnayos, that's on him. Rav Nachman's on Amora, he shouldn't be ignoring a Mishnah and discussing a Bryce.
I struggle with Tosfos with kosher can Titul min HaTsad at the end.
Yeah, I'll get to that. Yes, yeah. Yes. No, okay. There is another aspect of Tosfos. I'll just explain the question, but I'm only going to get to that in a minute. Tosfos doesn't. I've explained Tosfos just to avoid complications. I said it the way I said it. But the truth is, Tosfos thinks he has an even more powerful question. He thinks that case of lifting up the bed is worse than our case. In other words, the direct reverse of what you're saying. I'm not saying our case is a stricter case of Titul and HaTsad. Tosfos thinks it's a simpler case, an easier case, a lighter case of Titul and HaTsad. Sorry, a more significant moving in that case. Our case is a lighter case. And Tosfos says if that's allowed, Kal V'chomer, our case is allowed. And I'm also not entirely sure what that Kal V'chomer means. I'll explain in a moment what I think it means, but we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, let's ignore whether it's a Kal V'chomer or identical. Either way, Tosfos is lining up. Radish is like the bed. Earth on top of it is like the money. You can lift the bed even though you're lifting the money. Why is Rav Nachman getting worried about lifting radishes even though you're lifting the earth? He's an Amora. He shouldn't be arguing with a Mishnah. Okay, that's the Mashal I was reading. Now, the reading of the Mashal is not entirely great in at least our text of Tosfos, because in our text of Tosfos doesn't sound entirely like he's asking on Rav Nachman. Even though the heading of Tosfos is a Rav Nachman heading, he says, what's the basis of the man deshori, the opinion that allows, and what's the basis of the man deosa, the opinion that doesn't allow? In other words, he seems to be talking about two opinions over here, the opinion that allows and the opinion that doesn't allow. So it sounds like he's going back on the Rabbanon and Rabbizobin Tadoi over here. He's not referring to Rav Nachman. He's talking about two man de'omrim. So I was pondering this until I noticed that in the next Mashal, he's not go-race the word man. He quotes Tosfos. I don't know if deliberately or he had a different version. He just says, my Tama Deshori or my Tama Deosa. What's the reason for allowing? What's the reason for not allowing? Rather than two opinions. In our version of Tosfos, you have to say the man Deshori is Rav Nachman originally, and the man Deosa is Rav Nachman in the conclusion, because the Gemara says Rav Nachman changes his mind. But either way, the Mashal is learning that Tosfos is asking on Rav Nachman. And Rav Nachman is two characters here in the Gemara, because you have the initial Rav Nachman and then you have Rav Nachman who changed his mind as per the Maskana of the Gemara, and that's how Tosfos reads. I'm just pointing out it's not the simplest reading of the Gemara. Okay, Tosfos in his question, as Martin pointed out, is it assumes that not only is the Gemara about moving the bed equal to our Gemara, but in fact, it's worse. It's potentially a worse type of moving. And even so, the Gemara allows it. Kal Chom over here, why is Rav Nachman forbidding it? That's Tosfos in his question. And I'm not entirely sure why he sees it as worse. To the best of my understanding, this may be wrong, so please have a think about this and see if you're correct. I did try and learn the Gemara in Kufman Base and the Mishnah there and try and understand it. To the best of my knowledge, Tosfos' point is as follows. In our case over here, you are moving the radish or the cake or the fruit, and you have no interest whatsoever in the straw or the coals or the earth. If it was the opposite extreme, that your whole intention was to move the Muktza item, we already saw that wouldn't be allowed. That's not called Titul and HaTsad. That's what we showed him earlier, right? If you're lifting a stretcher, but your real intention is just to move the dead body, that's called direct engagement with the dead body. Our scenario, our sukya is somewhere in the middle. You are moving the fruit because you want the fruit. Sorry, our sukya is the opposite extreme. You have no interest in the Muktza at all. The case of the bed is somewhere in the middle. You're moving the bed with the money on, or you're moving the chavis, the wine cask, with a stone on. You only want the wine or the bed, but you do care what happens to the stone or the money and how it moves. Why is that? Because you want the stone to fall off so that it's not blocking the cask. And look in the Mishnah there, you don't want it to fall off in a way that will damage other casks. So you're careful how you move it off. And similarly, even though you're moving, you'll be perfectly happy with the money staying on the bed. But now that you do need the bed, you again want the money to fall. You want to move the money with care so you don't lose your money. So you're not disinterested in the Muktza item. Why does the concept of Titul and HaTsad still apply? Because your intention is not to move the Muktza item. Your intention is to move the non-Muktza item. Again, with three levels, basically. We have the case of moving the bed with the dead body on, where your whole intention is to move the dead body. You're just doing so via moving the Muktza item. You can't call that Titul and HaTsad. On the opposite extreme, you have a case where you have no interest in the Muktza whatsoever. You're just pulling out the fruit, and the Muktza, you're discarding it. And then you have a middle situation where your real intention is to get access to the non-Muktza item, that's true, but you do care about the manner in which the Muktza item is moving. And that's Tosfos' Kal V'chomer over here, because he calls this a higher level of Titul min HaTsad. He calls it's like a Titul Gomel, he almost refers to it as. And therefore he says, if that's allowed, Kal V'chomer of Nachman should have allowed our case over here. That's the Kal V'chomer of Tosfos. Now, all three scenarios are referred to by the Gemara as Titul and HaTsad. And that gets me to my first introduction, that not all Titul and HaTsad are created equal, some are more equal than others. In other words, even though the Gemara refers to them all as Titul and HaTsad, what it really means is all of them are to a degree indirect engagement. But you can't just stop there. You have to think more carefully about degrees of indirect engagement. There is no one topic called indirect engagement with Muktza. There's a multitude of layers of indirect engagement, and they're going to have differing halachas depending on the degree of indirect engagement. So someone stops you in the street or wakes up in the middle of the night and says, is indirect engagement with Muktza allowed or not allowed? Is Titul and HaTsad allowed or not allowed? You can't answer that question with a yes or no answer. You need to say it depends how indirect the indirect engagement is, and don't be fooled by the sugyas that give them all the same headline label. There's nothing inaccurate in the Gemara. It's true to say they're all Titul and HaTsad, they're all indirect engagement, but what the Gemara is calling on us to do is think through each type of indirect engagement, and they're not all the same. Okay, so this is Tosaf's question, and in Tosaf's answer, he forces us to think about these layers of Titul and HaTsad equally. And again, in my explanation of Tosaf's answer, I'm effectively relying on the Mashal and the reading of the Mashal. And Tosaf's answer basically is that there's three levels of bosses. So again, the concept of bosses is that a non-Muktza item becomes subsumed to a Muktza item. I have a tray, which is non-Muktza. I put my candlesticks on top of the tray, and if I plan to leave them there the whole of Shabbos, I'm dedicating the tray to the service of Muktza, and therefore the tray also becomes Muktza. That's the concept of a bosses. So suppose there's three scenarios really of bosses, and they line up with the three types of with the different layers of Titul and HaTsad as we presented, and that's going to be Tosaf's answer. They're not all bosses the same. Extreme bosses number one. Or three cases, if you like. Extreme bosses number one is where I put something on top of another item, and I plan deliberately, and I plan to leave it there forever. Not forever, for the whole of Shabbos. So I want my tray to sit under my candlesticks because that's how I like my tray being. So that certainly is a bosses. I've dedicated the tray to the service of the flames, bosses, no doubt. Then I have a case where I accidentally forget something on top of something else. So Shabbos came in, and in a rush, I put down my car keys on top of a tray. Shachach, I forgot them there. That's no bosses at all, or at least a minimal form of bosses, because I never intended to place it there. I didn't consciously intend to get the tray to serve the Muktza item. I just accidentally forgot a Muktza item on top of the tray. That wouldn't be a bosses at all, or if it is a bosses, it's a very minimal form of bosses. That's the opposite extreme. And in the middle, I have a middle tier bosses, where I deliberately place something on the tray, but I didn't intend to leave it there the whole of Shabbos. So that's somewhere in the between. Because on the one hand, I did deliberately make the tray subsumed to the object sitting on top of it. On the other hand, I didn't intend to leave it there on Shabbos. I never meant to repurpose the tray for Muktza functionality, and therefore that's somewhere in between. That's the first sort of analysis of Tosaf. The second analysis of Tosaf, and this is where it gets very interesting and also a little confusing, is he tells us, till now, we've thought that there's two separate sugyas going on. You first need, and by the way, till I learned this Tosaf in Mashal, my whole life I've believed this to be the case. In my mind, I always said, and I always told people, and this is accurate, this is not mistaken, it's just missing something, that when you need to decide whether you can move a non-Muktza item with a Muktza item sitting on top of it, you need to ask yourself, you need to go through an algorithm, sort of a flow chart. The first question you need to ask yourself is the base, has it become Muktza through becoming infected with Muktza through becoming a bosses? In which case nothing starts because it's a bosses. And question number two you need to ask yourself is, even if it's not a bosses, I'm indirectly moving the Muktza item, Titul and HaTsad, is Titul and HaTsad allowed or not? In Tosaf, it becomes apparent that there's a third dimension going over here, that Titul and HaTsad is affected by the laws of bosses itself. In other words, the relationship between the under object and the over object, between the tray and the candlesticks, it affects not just whether the tray becomes infected with Muktza and therefore bosses, but it also affects the nature of Titul and HaTsad. And the logic behind this is that the whole point of Titul and HaTsad is that I'm not directly engaging with the Muktza. But if I've repurposed the tray to some degree or other to be the base on which the Muktza sits, when I'm moving the tray, I'm more directly engaging with the Muktza item than if I hadn't done that. So what I said till now is correct. You need to ask yourself, has the under object become its own Muktza because of bosses? Absolutely true. Okay, let's give this a real life scenario, right? Shabbos morning, I want to put my suit jacket on or my trousers on. I put them in, and I realize that I've left the car keys and my credit cards and my money in my trouser pocket. So I need to ask myself a question: was it shochach or not? Was it forget? Or was it deliberate? Maybe I had a chasna on Monday, and I knew on some Motzi Shabbos, and I knew I was going to wear the Shabbos, and I deliberately put the keys in, and forgotten I wanted to wear it Shabbos morning. Was it shochach? Was I intending to move it? So I need to ask myself all the bosses questions. Have the trousers become a bosses to the Muktza item? Now I need to ask myself the second question. Okay, but a Maisa Tachlis, if I'm putting the trousers on, I will be moving the credit card or the car key. Am I allowed to do that or not? That's Titul min HaTsad. So that's very true. That's all accurate. Tosfos simply now says that even the lomdus of indirect moving, Titul min HaTsad, will be effective depending upon the relationship between the bosses and the Muktza item, because if there's a deeper relationship, then Titul min HaTsad becomes ever more stretched. Because if I've dedicated this object as the base or the place within which the Muktza sits, I'm more directly engaging with the Muktza item, and that's the innovation that emerges from Tosfos. I just want to summarize the maths of how Tosfos lays this out, and then we'll have run out of time for today. And on Tuesday, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll revisit this and try and conceptually absorb it. But basically, Tosfos says there's, as I've introduced already, that there are layers to the heter of Titul min HaTsad. And he says, in the case where I am doing the more direct engagement, like the case of the barrel with the stone, or the bed with the money, that's only allowed in the case of shochach. That's the lowest level of bosses. I never intended to make a bosses, I just forgot something on it. In the case of nior, where I just shake something off, it's allowed even where maniach, even where I deliberately place it there. And the machlokas, the Rabbanon and the Rabbizobin today, is in the case where I didn't. Sorry, let's start again. In the case of shochach, even the deeper degree of Titul is allowed, which is the case of the barrel or with a stone on, or the bed with the money on. In the case of maniach, where I deliberately place it there, but only temporarily, it doesn't become a bossis. And in that case, nior, shaking off, is definitely allowed. That's scenario number 2. And scenario number 3 is, in the case of maniach, where I didn't intend to leave it there the whole of Shabbos, and I want to do a weaker form of Titul min HaTsad, which is lifting out the radish or the cake, and I have no interest in the Muktza, I just want the Muktza to be discarded, that would be the machlokas, Rabbanon and Rabbizobin today. That's the maths of what Tosfos says. So let me just say this once more, just to be crystal clear, of the maths of Tosfos before we begin pondering what this means. You have a case where there's no bosses at all, nothing to talk about. You've only got pure Titul min HaTsad. You have a case of bosses, where the under thing has become infected with the Muktza, nothing to talk about, it's bosses now, so tough luck. Even there's no heter here whatsoever. And then we have 2 middle scenarios of bosses. We have shochach, which Tosfos considers to be the lower level of bosses. I never intended to make it bosses at all. And you have maniach, where I deliberately placed it there, but not intending to the whole of Shabbos, which Tosfos considers the higher level of bosses. Says Tosfos, in these middle scenarios, you can do degrees of Titul min HaTsad. If it's shochach, which is the weaker type of bosses, you're even allowed to lift it up where I care what happens to the Muktza. I want my coins or my stone to fall with care. In the case of maniach, where I intended to put it there, and but not for the whole of Shabbos, nior, shaking off, definitely would be allowed. Lifting up, like lifting up the radish, where I am directly moving the Muktza, but I have no interest in what happens to the Muktza, that would be a machlokas Rabbanon and Rabbizobin today. That's the maths of Tosfos' answers. Now, there's a lot to think about in that, both just to get clear on the maths and understand what Tosfos is saying. Secondly, to go back and see how Tosfos then is reading all the Gemaras. And thirdly, to understand conceptually what this means. So that will be our work for Tuesday, and I'm jolly pleased that I have the gap till then for my own work and trying to understand this, and for everyone actually to work through it, because this is a tough mathematical Tosfos. This is not an easy mission, and this takes quite a lot of work to work through. But that's where we'll pause, and in Mitzvah Hashem, that will be our avodah in the Onol HaTorah, on the toil of Torah for Tuesday evening in Mitzvah Hashem. Stop there, and I wish everyone a wonderful day. Yeah, it's over 4 seconds. Yeah, Edward, as I finish here, let out a little sigh of. And I don't blame you. Absolutely, this is a tough Tosfos. And once we finish Tosfos, though, we'll move on to the next sugya, which undoubtedly will be much clearer and easier. No doubt about it. So, this Hashem. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.